The Spirit of Jazz podcast, where music dances with mystery, with your hosts, Bill Carter and Jeff Kellum.
Welcome to the Spirit of Jazz podcast. This is Bill Carter. Jeff Kellum is off today. Today we have the great opportunity to continue our conversation with Derrick Bang. Derrick is the biographer of Vince Guaraldi, and he lives in Davis, California. Welcome, Derrick. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Bill. Good to be back.
So, a lot of people love A Charlie Brown Christmas, but they have no idea that Guaraldi wrote church music. How in the world did this ever get started?
The genesis is very similar to how Guaraldi's affiliation with Charlie Brown and the Peanuts Gang came about. That happened as a result of director-producer Lee Mendelsohn driving across the Golden Gate Bridge and hearing Cast Your Fate to the Wind on the radio just at the point when he knew he wanted to have some jazz music in the first special he was putting together about the Peanuts Gang. In early 1964, Chuck Gompertz, a young minister in Northern California, who was part of the Episcopalian team that was gathering ideas about what to do to celebrate the year in advance of the opening of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. A June 1964 Society page article in the San Francisco Chronicle featured photos of some elders gathering with some of the hoi polloi in San Francisco. The headline gave rise to the fact that one of the ideas being contemplated was a holy hootenanny.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, Chuck, Charles Gompertz, I think I knew him well enough to call him Chuck. He was appalled by that. He thought it reflected a certain lack of reverence for the situation. So he did something very foolish. He called his boss, Bishop James Pike, and said as much. And Bishop Pike said, you're right. You take care of it. Fill the place next May. Chuck hung up the phone, looked at his wife and said, that's it. My career's over. I'll have to find something else to do. And he does what all tormented souls do at moments of crisis. He drew himself a warm bath. And as he's sitting contemplating his spot in the state of the universe, the radio in the other room happened to play Cast Your Fate to the Wind. And it was a revelation. And Chuck thought, that's it. That's what we should do. We should put together a jazz mass, which would be a strikingly new thing in the United States in the mid-1960s. Not the first time it had happened, as it turns out, but certainly one of the very first times that such an idea had been floated. And whoever it is that's playing that tune is exactly the guy I want to be involved with. Now, Chuck wasn't familiar enough with current music to recognize the tune. So he called the radio station, found out that it was Cast Your Fate to the Wind, done by Vince Guaraldi, who worked with Fantasy Records. Chuck had a friend that he thought might know how to get in touch with somebody at Fantasy Records. He called the friend. The friend did indeed know and gave him a phone number. Chuck called Fantasy Records, and Max Weiss happened to be in the office. Chuck briefly outlined his suggestion. Max said, great, I'll give you the number that Guaraldi's wife Shirley uses when she references calls for him. So Chuck called that number and Shirley picked up the phone. He briefly mentioned his suggestion. She said, well, hang on a minute. Let me go get Vince. Vince gets on the phone. Chuck outlines the suggestion. Vince listens for a while and finally says something along the lines of, well, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, why not me? Guaraldi had no shortage of modesty. When Chuck told this story years later, the thing that amazed him most was that all the players were in position that morning. Everybody he called was available and was able to pass the suggestion along. Vince and Chuck got together several times. First time they met was at the Trident over in Sausalito. And the thing that amazed Chuck the most was that everybody knew Guaraldi. People walking into the restaurant would come over and say hello to him. They were having lunch outdoors. People going by in boats would shout, hey, Vince, how's it going? And it was clear to Chuck that Guaraldi was, at least within this sphere, a much admired and genuinely adored jazz figure. As they discussed ideas on how to bring this about and how to put it together, Chuck knew that they were guaranteed to encounter some friction. If not from within the church, then likely from more conservative factions within the general public.
And why would that be?
Well, I know as we sit here, we look back on the 60s and think of it as the beginning of an enlightened time of some sort. Mm-hmm. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of the country was still extremely conservative. A lot of people still felt that jazz was the devil's music. There were racist overtones to this, without question, but there were simply a lot of people who felt that it would be inappropriate to bring saloon music into a house of worship. And they felt very strongly about this. And I imagine we'll be talking about that aspect of this project a little bit later.
Oh, sure. When I did my first jazz service at my church in Pennsylvania in 1992, there was a small boycott among the ultra pious. They said, well, I'll come back next week, but I'm not going to come for that. They wouldn't even give it a chance. That was it. So how did Vince go about putting this together? What were the moving pieces?
Chuck's input was to suggest that Guaraldi use as a template the Marbach setting of the Eucharist, a plain chant setting, mm-hmm. and collaborate with a choir. And Chuck happened to know Barry Minia, who led the choir at St. Paul's Church in San Rafael, and got in touch with him, put forth the idea. Barry was also eager to jump on board. And so Chuck and Barry and Vince began, I'm not quite sure how you would describe the process of adapting a plain chant church setting. It must have been a fascinating conversation initially.
I think so. And Guaraldi was not a great reader of written music, was he?
No, he was not, but he was a good Catholic boy. So he was not unfamiliar with the church setting.
Okay.
And he had thoughts in that direction. As things came together, it became apparent that Guaraldi and his trio would provide a jazz accompaniment to the choral portions of the Mass under construction. And then when other things were happening that did not involve singing, such as the breaking of the bread and the sipping of the wine, taking communion, during those points in time, Guaraldi and the trio would improvise with instrumental backdrop. And of course, Grace Cathedral is an extremely large place. And as it eventually happened, communion took a very long time. The improvisation that Guaraldi's trio did from what Chuck described lasted well over half an hour. The thing that frustrated Barry the most as rehearsals began with the adults and children in the choir was that once Vince and his trio began noodling their way into the improvisational bits that they were going to be performing, it was never the same way twice. You know, Barry, as a choir director, lived in a universe where everything was set and you didn't run around changing things.
So Guaraldi kept changing up the accompaniment while the choir would sing the same thing.
Of course.
And I'm guessing that if children were involved in some of the singing, as I recall they were, that probably had to be taught to them by rote as well.
They were told early on to focus exclusively on what they were singing and not pay the slightest bit of attention to what initially it was just Guaraldi. And then as the actual date approached, the full trio, not pay attention at all to what they were doing because it would only screw them up.
Oh, right.
Because, of course, The kids in particular, and I'm sure some of the adults as well, they were enchanted by the fact that they were in the presence of Northern California jazz royalty.
Sure.
I mean, this was a guy who won a Grammy Award, for goodness sake.
And did they have any idea what this was going to look like, any of them? Or was it just a grand experiment?
It was a grand experiment, inventing the wheel as you go along. I would love to have been a fly on the wall during the initial planning phases, the conversations between Vince and Chuck and Barry, particularly during the early weeks as they decided which songs, which hymns to use, how to place them, where the instrumental accompaniment should bridge particular gaps, where the gaps should be.
Well, and as you know, I went looking for that material in the fall of 2014, thinking it would be kind of fun to do a 50th anniversary. So I got in touch with Grace Cathedral and asked if I could speak with their music staff. With some chagrin, they said, well, we really don't have any copy of the music, meaning the written music. And I said, isn't it in some filing cabinet? Well, no, they sang it out of the old red hymnal, in the back of the red hymnal. And I said, well, what about what the instrumentalists played? And there was like stone silence.
Yes.
Although Vince did create some bossa nova settings, and the chant would float very well on top of that. A couple of the movements were almost identical in what the band was playing. And they were just like the musical bed over which the chant floated. So how did this all continue to develop?
Rehearsals took place twice a week on Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings, and they lasted several hours each session. I've spoken many times with the now adult individuals who were part of the children's contingent of that group. They all agree that Barry was very serious about the project.
Mm-hmm.
You could not miss rehearsals unless you had an extremely good reason, because he didn't want the nature of the sound to change at all, not even one voice's worth.
Okay.
They would break midpoint. The adults would go off and smoke cigarettes in most cases, and Vince would go outside and play with the kids, which was the subject of great concern to some of the church members, because Vince was out there racing downhill on a skateboard, just like one of the kids, and everybody was afraid he'd fall off and break a hand or something, break his wrist, break his fingers, and put the project in jeopardy. But that was Vince. Kids loved him. Okay. He was small in stature, and so they probably related to him better than they did to people who were considerably taller. But he also apparently had a very easygoing nature and just loved to hang out with them. They remember the big comb that he had in his back pocket,
okay,
which he'd pull out and use to comb his hair. They loved his mustache. And of course, by then, Vince was notoriously famous for the size and style of his mustache, very distinctive. They had a good time with him, and that probably contributed greatly to the fact that their interest was held during what was almost a full year of bringing this thing together. Mm. That's a lot of rehearsal time.
Well, let's turn the calendar forward a little bit. So as the date approached, what other preparations were put into place? And we're talking about May 1965, right?
Yep. As May 21st, 1965 approached, the rehearsals became more frequent, but they continued to take place at St. Paul's Church. Although everybody in the Episcopal Church body was excited about this from the very beginning, the cathedral staff itself was much less enthused and made no effort to allow any sort of rehearsal in the cathedral until literally a couple nights prior. That proved potentially difficult because Grace Cathedral has a significant lag time. And so what you sing from one end of the cathedral echoes back to you half a heartbeat later, which, of course, if you're not prepared for that, is going to mess up the next note you sing or play. And all of the choir members had no experience with that kind of echo situation. Just as Barry had said early on, pay no attention to what Vince and his sidemen are doing. Now we had to say, pay no attention to anything other than the next note you're about to sing. because if you get caught up in listening to yourself, you'll be lost. They had almost no practice with that. And considering how clean the recording is on the album that Fantasy eventually released, they all compensated very well, quite obviously.
Yeah.
The cathedral staff also got petty on the day itself. Vince and Chuck and Barry and everybody else, they weren't allowed to set up until just a couple of hours prior to the doors being opened for the actual Mass, because there was a 5 o'clock service that the cathedral staff had refused to move. So, of course, nobody could go in until that was finished. After it happened, of course, and it became such a cause célèbre, it's amazing how quickly the cathedral staff reversed course and said, oh, we want to do this again.
Well, sure. And so they go on and they book Duke Ellington to come and do a concert of religious music. But it wasn't the Mass. It wasn't the Mass like this. It wasn't the worship service.
Correct. It was more, I guess you'd call it more of a performance.
So tell us about the other components of the service that you know. I know there was some organ music, which did not make the recording, but there was a very famous or infamous preacher that was booked as well.
If we become lost in religion and cut off from God, we become whores whose self-interest, self-respect, the studied practice of don't rock the boat, and the gods we have made in our own image.
Malcolm Boyd, the coffee house preacher.
He had marched with Dr. King in Selma, as I believe.
Oh, he had done all kinds of things. Malcolm Boyd was even more controversial than the notion of bringing jazz into Grace Cathedral. And this was another one of Chuck's suggestions early on. And I admire his gumption, his chutzpah. Mm-hmm. Not enough to risk censure by organizing a jazz mass in Grace Cathedral. He makes it worse by turning around and bringing in Malcolm Boyd to deliver the sermon. It was a very noteworthy sermon. Not fire and brimstone, and certainly, by today's standards, there was certainly nothing wrong or outrageous or even provocative about it. But again, 1965, more innocent times.
And I recall Bishop Pike stood up and greeted everybody and took a good measure of credit for how wonderful his idea was.
Oh, yes.
If you agree with this next statement of mine, say in a loud voice, Hallelujah. Isn't this great?
Hallelujah.
Thank you.
Chuck is a genuinely modest guy. He was not the slightest bit bothered about that. Actually, he said more than once during the many interviews that I had with him that he actually liked being in the sidelines, because that way he could pay attention to everything and immediately correct course if it looked like something was slipping into the wrong direction.
And before Chuck passed a few years ago, my wife and I had a chance to spend an afternoon with him and his wife overlooking the reservoir high on the hill where he lived, and looking actually across the hill to a Skywalker Ranch where his wife was employed. And he told me that there had been some threats against him for concocting this idea of a jazz mass.
Indeed. The event took place in Northern California. It really wasn't publicized outside of Northern California. So everybody involved didn't hear too much angry commentary because the event simply wasn't that well known. There were some people in the immediate area, of course, who complained, as we discussed earlier, about the fact that jazz was coming into Grace Cathedral, but nothing really threatening or menacing, shall we say.
Okay.
However, because the Mass was such a success, it was subsequently written up and discussed in everything from Time magazine to Reader's Digest. In fact, Chuck loved to say, that's when my mother knew I was famous, when I was mentioned in Reader's Digest. And of course, these are all national publications. And that's when a lot of hate mail started coming in. Chuck said at one point, in the weeks and months after, I received hate mail from people who felt that we had taken the devil's music and brought it into Holy Church, and those were the nice letters. This was before the Summer of Love. people were still pretty naive and traditional and locked into the mindset of the 1950s. And in one fell swoop in their minds, we had challenged that. The worst, Chuck went on to say, was a letter that arrived in the mail in a plain white envelope with his address printed crudely on the front. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, its letter obviously written on an old typewriter with a tattered ribbon. The letter threatened the life of Chuck's young daughter, who was in first grade at the time. The writer obviously knew the girl's movements each morning. "She walks down this street," Chuck repeated from memory when I chatted with him decades later. "Then she turns right and walks down this street to the Coleman School. She does this at 8:30 in the morning. We're watching her, and we don't like what you've been doing to the church and to music in the church. We wanted to let you know that the California Minutemen are keeping an eye on you."
Oh, my goodness.
That, Chuck concluded, pausing for emphasis, was very disconcerting. Fortunately, nothing came of it.
Well, and, it lays out one of the dividing lines that we've worked on earlier in this podcast about what is sacred and what is secular. And my contention is there's a dotted line between them. God can find you in the smoky nightclub, and God can leave you alone in the big cathedral.
That's a very nice way of putting it, Bill.
Yeah. So when you get some sense of spiritual presence or transcendence or extraterrestrial power falling on you, it can happen pretty much anytime. And the people around you might not feel a thing.
Of course.
But then to dismiss jazz musicians as indifferent or as outright pagans, it's often a caricature and a false one. Well, what do you know about Guaraldi's church going?
Oh, he didn't. He was raised Catholic, so I'm sure his mother, took him to Mass every week, was very diligent about it. But once Guaraldi got back from the Korean War during his couple years of service and began performing professionally and putting together a career, I got no indication that he attended church at all from that point forward. Certainly none of the people with whom I spoke, and at this point, that number's well over 50, 60, 70 folks, said anything at all about Guaraldi attending church under any circumstances, except when he performed the jazz mass at Grace Cathedral, and also about half a dozen times subsequent to that, when the mass, either in whole or portions thereof, were again performed in different settings, including the following January at Chuck's own little parish in the church at Ignacio in Marin.
He's created a minor masterpiece here. It was novel, it was fresh, but it has never really taken off. And many people have no clue that he ever composed such a thing. How do you attribute that?
Well, it was actually pretty impressive that Fantasy released an album that compressed and presented the best portions of the Mass. They didn't have to do that. It must have been kind of surprising, actually, when the suggestion even came up. The album exists, but it has never been noticed that much in Guaraldi's canon, if you will. And Guaraldi made no effort to encourage its presentation outside of Northern California. And it's not something he ever referenced either later in life. Mm-hmm. He was always focused on whatever he happened to be doing at that particular moment. And I guess that making that music and the Mass itself available to a broader audience would have been the responsibility, at least in part, of Grace Cathedral. I find it ironic, by the way, and this may go a little ways toward answering that question, when Jim Martinez, jazz pianist in Northern California, did a concert version of the Mass as part of the 50th anniversary back in 2015, in the summer of 2015, and all of us who were going to be watching or participating arrived, we were early enough to spend some time at the Grace Cathedral gift shop. And I noted with some dissatisfaction that they had CDs of the Duke Ellington 1965 performance, but they didn't have any copies of Guaraldi's Fantasy album. So it's almost like the indifference continued half a century later.
Another Charlie Brown moment.
I guess. I'm going to throw that question back at you, Bill. What keeps a Mass alive? What keeps a particular presentation of a Mass alive? It has to be shared, right?
It has to be shared, and it has to be more than the novelty of it. I think it would probably have helped if this had been transcribed and published at the time, and then a publisher would take advantage of that and broadcast that, advertise that, but that's never been done.
The 50th anniversary presentations that took place both with your congregation and the one that I just mentioned in San Francisco a month earlier, they didn't light any fires.
No, I think time has passed. One novelty has been replaced by 1,000 others. So what do you think the legacy of this project might be?
Well, I wish more people who wrote stories about Guaraldi from various perspectives would bother to mention it. They almost never do. It is nice in a pop culture sense that he remains to this day so firmly associated with the music for Charlie Brown and the Gang. But it is frustrating that almost nobody is aware of his equally groundbreaking development of his own jazz mass. That's a massive thing.
Yes, it is.
But I don't know. History is fickle, isn't it? Guaraldi was all but forgotten in the 1980s and early 90s. He died in 1976 because during the final 7 years of his life, he didn't have a record label, so he wasn't releasing any albums. He didn't really like touring. And he didn't need to because he could stay in Northern California and work in the clubs there and work with Lee Mendelson on whatever the next Peanuts project happened to be. And if you don't tour, you don't get acknowledged or recognized or publicized. The opportunity to keep the Mass alive was minimal during the years after he presented it for the first time. And the fact that he died so young robbed him of the opportunity to perhaps help keep it alive. You know, the fact that he and his trio presented the Mass half a dozen more times in the years following 1965 suggests that he may have continued to do that. And it seems clear to me that Guaraldi would have wanted to keep it alive somehow, because Chuck told me that in the immediate aftermath of the Grace Cathedral debut, he and Vince briefly wound up on something of a lecture circuit together. Some of the schools in and around San Francisco would ask the two of them to come and discuss the Mass and its creation. And as Chuck said, they were a novelty. Here's church and here's a secular saloon player, as Vince described himself. And people wanted to know how they got together and came up with this wonderful thing. So Chuck would tell the story. And if there were a piano in the room, Vince would comp softly in the background. Can you imagine anything more enchanting?
Not at all. And yet it seems so distant now to even consider something like that being done in a public school.
Boy, you aren't kidding. Way too progressive.
We're talking with Derrick Bang today, Vince Guaraldi's biographer. His book, Vince Guaraldi at the Piano. You'll find a link to how to get your own copy in our show notes. Derrick, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Oh, you're very welcome, Bill. As I'm sure you're aware, Vince is one of my favorite topics, and I could go on for hours and days. And I know that you're a kindred spirit, and that makes it all the more enjoyable.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Spirit of Jazz podcast. This is a production of Presbybop Music. To find out more about Presbybop, our music, concerts, and recordings, please explore our website at www.presbybop.com and send us a note telling us what you think about the Spirit of Jazz. We'd love to hear from you. Check in with us again next time. I'm Jeff Kellum.
And I'm Bill Carter. Thanks for tuning in.